Hey there friends, Martin here and welcome to this new video on my channel where I focus on breaking down this shot from my short film Heroes of Bronze. I've already made a series of videos focused on all the tools I used for its production. By the way, go ahead and watch it if you haven't already. This time, however, I wanted to go a bit deeper on various specific topics. Well, not as deep as going step by step, that would probably result in a whole course, but I will definitely point out various tutorials and courses along the way where you can learn all my techniques in more detail. Rest assured though, I will also share various tips and workflows I find interesting about this particular scene. So yeah, this shot, what a beast to build this was. And what's interesting about it is that most of the workflows I used on it were pretty elementary. I mean, relatively. Most obvious, this shot is made of, well, heck of a lot of 3D soldiers here and in the background, including some 2D soldiers on planes. Then there's the ground in here and the mountains in the back with some extra effects like dust and the flying arrows. So let's jump into it and go through the scene layer by layer. So first, let's have a brief look at the environment. For that, I really just made a plane using the ANT landscape tool and choosing this large landscape preset, then squashing it on Z-axis and sculpting it, I achieved, well, basically a flat plane. It may seem like an overkill, but I usually like to start with this base to have at least some randomness to my ground plane. With that, I applied one of my favorite Mediterranean textures that I got out of the GIS add-on and then cleaned it in Photoshop to be rid of any houses or anything man-made. By the way, I go into detail on this add-on in my huge CG Boost course. There I basically break down all of my environment workflows I know in Blender, guiding you through the creation of scenes such as these. For additional detail, I went into my favorite Enviro add-on called Geoscatter and scattered some generic grass and detail all around this area of the plane. I have actually scattered this with an older version of the add-on, which back then used particles for this sort of work, but nowadays it is called Geoscatter. So indeed, it scatters using geometry nodes, which is so much more powerful. The workflow, nevertheless, is still the same. I basically just choose from a preset that I like. And by the way, there is a great library of free presets you can choose from once you get the add-on. But in my case, I in fact chose this Scatter Pro library and the Wasteland 02 preset. And then I let the add-on do its job. Afterwards, just limiting the scattering to my camera with this option here. And also, I painted some custom weight maps to limit the areas where the various grass, branches, and gravel appear even more. In fact, next month, I might do a full tutorial on this add-on, since I've been using it so much on this project. Anyways, once the plane was filled with detail, I proceeded to the far background. But since it wasn't really the focus of the shot, I didn't spend too much time on it either. As you can see, I basically just took a photo from my library, placed it on a very large plane, and then put the plane so far in the distance, it didn't really feel like it's 2D. Putting it so far away actually increases the feeling of epicness in this shot, when the parallax is so intense that the far background is moving much slower than the foreground. You can add a lot of scale to your shots. When it comes to shading, you can see the main thing was I plugged it into the emission socket here. That's what makes it independent of the lighting of the scene. Otherwise, it would be influenced only by my HDRI, making it much darker. These two nodes here, I basically just played with the color, mixing in some color of dust, and then darkening the image a little bit. Well, that was really it for this element. I just then picked an HDRI from my folder of favorites. And yes, it was once again this Spruce Sunrise, probably the most overused HDRI in Blender community, certainly by me. And since I knew that the army will absolutely dominate the shot, I went on making it. Let's have a look first at the layer in the very front, which I called the base. Usually I call base the layer which I later on start with in the compositing process. But you can call these anything you want, as long as it helps you orient yourself in the shot. And here you can see it's made of lots of little soldiers, but not actually as many as how it feels in the camera view. The key is having a lot of characters come in and out of the shot edges to feel like there is even more of them outside the view. And also to have some shadows coming from outside of the shot onto the soldiers that are visible. That creates an illusion of bigger crowd, even if I'm in fact using just 195 soldiers apparently. Now I won't be going into the process of creating these soldiers. For one, it would take too much time, and two, I've already made a whole series about my character creation process available for free on this YouTube channel. So if you're interested in how I use Character Creator and iClone to generate my human meshes, animate them and then get them into Blender afterwards, head over to the link in the description. And when it comes to the various helmets, shields and armor, my website is full of links to tutorials and courses on that topic as well. So just take your pick. What you might notice is that these are in fact linked instances sourced from another file on my disk. This saves a ton of performance, especially if your assets in that separate blend file are well optimized, which I tried to do with these running soldiers. For my project, throughout the several years I worked on it, I made these libraries of various types of soldiers, all doing some cycling actions, which I can then put quickly into my shots. The main thing here was the variety. I tried to make each soldier a little different, with a little change in their pose maybe, to avoid obvious repetitions in the crowd. What I want to show you here is how I made these soldiers move a little bit out of sync when it comes to speed. I made this empty here, which I keyframed to move forward, roughly at the speed of a running hoplite. That of course I had to test around, so I used this constraint called child off on one of the soldiers, choosing the target to be the empty that I named like this, and then I played around with the speed of the movement. The key here is to not make the soldiers feel like they're either sliding or having their feet stuck in the ground, moving slower than they ought to. If you have a look at one foot at a time and ensure that they remain roughly on the spot where they landed at one single stride, you will surely achieve the proper timing. When you're then done with one soldier, you can simply select all the other instances, and with this built-in copy attributes add-on active, you simply shift select the soldier with the constraint already in, hit Ctrl C and copy it to all the other ones. Pro tip: you may then have to deactivate and activate the collection with your soldiers to make the constraint take effect. Anyways, with that done, you can simply go around and variously lower the influence of the constraint on random soldiers, making some of them move a little slower, because this way the movement of the empty has a little bit lower influence on them. Now, I'm absolutely sure there are some other very clever automated ways of randomizing the movement of your soldiers like this, like writing a Python tool for it, for example. But you know me, I'm not the most sophisticated in these things, so I like to power through, adjusting random values by hand. At least that's how I did it on Heroes of Bronze. Final thing which I'd like to point towards is I have this copy of the ground plane active here, but I have it in fact set to Shadow Catcher here. So my soldiers do cast a shadow on the ground, but I'm not actually showing the ground, and I'm able to render it separately then. I'll go over the render layers and the composition at the very end of the video. On this layer, you may see that there are some flying arrows here. Well, I in fact have this pre-built particle simulation, which I offer at my Patreon, among other free assets there. But it's really very simple. I have this arrow particle and I feed it into an emitter simulation with this normal velocity active and some randomization here. The emitter is in shape of these several planes with this dynamic orientation checked, and that way the arrows are always oriented towards the direction of their flight. The rest of the settings of the physics you can check here. Finally then, I had this plane with collision field active on it and all these parameters maxed out. This allowed the arrows to land and stick to the ground. Now we can move to the layer a bit more further away from the camera where the Persians are placed. I in fact had several layers of these Persian soldiers. First, I had the custom animations of a shield wall being built, which is something the Sparbara infantry used to do back then, building these wall-like formations to protect their archers. As you can see, I have again a separate file for this, and these animations, well, they are considerably more wonky and floaty than the hoplite animations. That's because I knew beforehand that most of what the audience will see from the Persians is behind the shields, and mostly from this angle. So I did not stress about the details too much. As long as it worked in the final shot, I was good with it. I actually recorded this animation using my Rococo suit. Again, let's not get into details on the characters and animations. You can either watch my free course for some info on it, or you can learn my animation pipeline at the Gumroad. These Persians I have linked into my scene and duplicated around until they formed this sort of line. And then behind them I created more layers of animation. I have BG Persians. BG stands for background. Some of these are standing around and some of them, to add variety, are running. These are in fact using the same animations as the Greeks, only slightly repurposed. And then there are more Persians further back, and this layer is called, somewhat unimaginatively, BBG Persians. Background, I guess. As you can see, in this layer, there are also some riders in the background. For these, I purchased this simple animated horse from Blender Market, and on its bones, parented various little armor details, plus I parented a sitting rider on its back. That's really it, not much more to it, apart from the fact that it looks horrible in a close-up. For these sorts of large shots though, it was quite enough. And then behind them, you guessed it, BBBG Persians. But watch out, there are actually 2D soldiers here, placed on 2D transparent planes. So that's worth explaining a little bit. I detail this workflow in the Anatomy of a Shot course, but basically what you do is place an orthographic camera in your scene, looking at the soldier from a set angle. You make sure you have a cyclic animation that repeats seamlessly, and then render out this animation segment so that you can later place it on a simple plane and cycle the image sequence there. You can also render out various other passes for it, like normal pass and specular pass, to randomize the glints and light bending, making the flat soldiers look a little bit more 3D. By not using detailed 3D models for everything, you can save an enormous amount of rendering time, especially when there's a lot of background soldiers that aren't really clearly visible. One layer that I haven't talked about yet is this dust layer, where I basically have my foreground soldiers and the ground active, and over it I have placed this sort of box with a volumetric shader on it. Its setup looks like this. Maybe difficult at first glance, but basically I'm just plugging a noise texture to the density of the principled volume node and then adjusting its contrast with the ramp node. With this spherical gradient then, that I'm mixing in with this node, I am cutting away from it so that it doesn't have the visible edges. You can learn all about these sorts of tricks in my clouds chapter in the environment course at CG Boost. Anyway, with all these soldiers, this dust element became very, very slow to render. And so I employed this little technique where instead of rendering this in cycles, as I did with everything, this dust element I've rendered in Eevee, with the soldiers being set to this holdout mode, making them punch holes in the alpha. You can see that setting this to Eevee makes everything so much faster. This allowed me to easily composite this Eevee dust over the other layers that were rendered in cycles. You can learn all about this technique in my other tutorial on this channel, where I detail its every step. Oh, and speaking of dust, I regularly use these 2D planes with transparency, simulating a layer of dust in between my other elements, adding a very nice effect with a minimum amount of performance drain. You can either take some sort of smoke texture and color it more orange, like I've done here, or you can make a gradient texture and plug it into the alpha of the BSDF shader, play with the mapping to be in the object mode and then rotation a little bit so that the gradient goes up like this. and then color it in this socket here to be more of a dusty color. Alright, that is it for the various layers of the shot, and then I proceeded to rendering everything out. If you know nothing about this topic, it is quite extensive, so I will have to relay you to a free tutorial I've made for CG Boost channel, because this is really quite outside the bounds of this breakdown video. At the end of the process, I got these layers, the base and its mist pass, giving me the depth of this ground scene to be able to composite with. Then the EV dust, the ground, the various layers of Persians, and finally the background sky. With that, I was able to jump into After Effects, which remains my go-to tool for compositing, and there I glued all this material together into the final shot. And really, once I start breaking this down, you'll see how much one can do in post-production to improve upon the raw render, and also save some mistakes. So first, I added the layer which I called base in the Blender file, which contained the Greeks. With that in the scene, I put in the ground sequence, but immediately I realized that I've made a mistake and not stretched it as much as I needed in the shot. And it is actually cut off on the sides here. No problem, I just duplicated the layer and stretched this bottom one horizontally, making it fill this space here. A dirty trick, but it worked. Next up, I added the Persians, the background Persians, the background Persians, and then the background Persians. Yeah, nothing like a great naming convention, right? Finally, I've added the sky and the mountain to the mix, but I again realized I made a silly mistake. I put the image too low in the 3D scene, making it show the top of the mountain behind my soldiers. And that is clearly not correct. The horizon line is completely wrong here. No problem though, I just raised it in the composition like this, and issue fixed. That together gave me the basic result. But of course, now was the time to improve this. So over this background, I've added the dust layer twice, once at 100% opacity, the other one at 50. Then, over that, I've overlaid the mist pass ever so slightly, making the stuff in the distance a bit lighter. And then finally I've started my favorite technique, adding the various colored layers masked out so that they simulate scattered light and dust. So first I added this layer of yellowish solid into the background with very low opacity and screen set as a blending mode. Next, another layer in front of the background Persians with similar intensity and blending. Above that, I added this quite intense screen layer simulating the sunshine, masked out to be only visible on the side here with a lot of feather to the mask. Over it came a bluish layer, masked out at the top here. This one simulates the blue light scattering from the sky. Finally, there is a second, larger layer that adds to the sun effect. So far, I've ignored these smoke layers that you may have noticed in between my layers. All these are using this sort of animated sequence of dust. And I've placed it at a low opacity in between my elements. Since the camera is moving, I actually had to track the shot so that the elements keep moving together with the camera move. You can see this one is parented to a null object, which on it has the tracking data. And by the way, null is an equivalent of empty that you know from Blender. So I've added several of these in the background and foreground, finishing the dustiness of the shot. This one is interesting, by the way, because here I'm using the mist pass to function as a luma matte. I wanted to respect the depth of the scene here so that soldiers in the foreground are actually not as obstructed by this dust element as those further in the background. So I put my mist pass, specifically used for this purpose, above the dust layer. And here I activated the Luma Matte option. What it means is, it takes the layer above it, and based on whatever is darker in that layer, it will make this layer below more transparent, and the white spots remain visible. So since my mist pass is more white, the further we go in the distance, the more were the soldiers in the background obstructed by this dust element. Subtle effect, but without it, these 2D dust elements tend to be less convincing. Finally, for those of you who've already taken some of my courses where I go over After Effects compositing, you know that I love to employ this shine effect, a plugin made by a company called Red Giant. On its own, with default settings and without any mask, it is pretty overwhelming. However, if you place it, for example, like this, then go down with the opacity of the shine and finally mask it to be only on some areas where you want it, of course with a pretty large feather, you will achieve a very nice effect. One that I've used constantly in the short film to improve my light volumetrics and sunshine effects. Then I've used a lot that I'm sometimes using to finalize my shots, and also a vignette. Before the end, what I like to do is to place the finished comp into another composition, naming this new one Final, and throwing a few post-process effects over it. For example, this chromatic aberration effect, which is an add-on by plugineverything.com, where you can get it for free, actually. Also, I've darkened the outside areas of the shot with simpler curves, and lastly, I've added a grain over all this, generated with this add grain effect. And with that, after weeks of work and a great amount of tweaking, the shot was complete. As you can see, it really wasn't filled with ingenious techniques and clever workflows. Rather, I chose simple steps, repeated many times over, to achieve an epic looking result, seemingly full of random detail, but in fact with a lot of repeated elements. If you are interested in me breaking down more of the shots from my short film, definitely let me know in the comments. I'll be happy to hear any suggestions. But with that, stay creative my friends, and until next time, Martin out.